I'm happy to talk about this initiative that we founded over the course of 2 years with a number of development actors, and then talk a little bit on the context of why we did this, where we're heading with the initiative, the underlying concepts that are founded, and the notion of how partner countries are looking into this issue and the larger development ecosystem as well. And I'll try to seek to tie in how we learn from the digital health space, but also how it benefits the digital health space as well. So before I move in, for those that aren't familiar with Dialogue, again, we are a specialized program within the UN Foundation that helps the ecosystem looks into the digital transformation issues. And we do this focusing on kind of 3 key areas. We do more global ecosystem alignments, talking about how to coordinate better in terms of digital investments and digital solutions, proving and strengthening. That goes into some of the advocacy efforts and the policy research activities that we work on. We also look practically into the technologies themselves, not so much into developing new solutions, but understanding how solutions come into the picture in a more interoperable and cohesive way, and also making it more discoverable, because a lot of times investment projects look into building solutions that are oftentimes quite valuable and quite useful, but it's not very exposed to the rest of the ecosystem in terms of reuse and so on. And also as I mentioned, that there's a part around helping ecosystem understand how to navigate digital transformation issues. And one way we'd also do this is to actually engage with countries and to help support developing their digital transformation strategies and look into implementations, roadmap, capacity as well, and to use that as an anchoring point through our own experience of how to do this well and help development partners look into similar approaches and
Sorry,
activities
Sherman.
as well.
I think the screen froze because we're still on the title slide. Oh, there. Thank you.
Sorry. Yeah, as I was saying before, this is the kind of what Dial does is to look into issues at an ecosystem level, but we also extrapolate understandings from actual experience in country engagements. And why we're doing this is because we continue to come up and observe these challenges in terms of scale up. And as the world shifts into some highly critical events in the recent times, the focuses are back towards very specific sectoral events, things around health crisis, like what we had experienced with COVID pandemic, the continued predicted failure to meet targets to circumvent environmental issues, and ongoing geopolitical conflicts. So in the context of already challenges that we've seen in the past in terms of a more resilient and coordinated digital transformation effort in countries, when it comes to especially low resource settings for those that are keeping pace on how they can seek the benefits from digitalizations, both as an enabler to provide services to citizens and people, but also to grow economy as well. The 4 key issues is around coordination, around siloing of country governments, where even line ministries themselves might not know as intimately as they should be on what each other is doing in terms of their digital transformation efforts, because it's stayed in the past traditionally quite within the sectors themselves. And then that kind of creates challenges around funding, because then you don't have an aggregated and hedge view of the entire demand of the country on what the digital services and infrastructures you really need, because efforts are developed within the sectors, and also then development fundings come within the sectoral requirements. So in order to elevate that kind of more systematic level of funding, we want to look into how to do this better in a more coordinated way. And then with fragmentation and siloing, you have fragmentation of ability to scale up. So then that begs us the question, as we try to rectify these current challenges already, but also at the same time these critical events that have happened, how do we continue to strive for a more coordinated way in digital development that seeks to benefit cross-domain? It seeks to provide cross-domain benefits, but also create that kind of agility to continue to serve people when there is a lot of economic vulnerability that we need to account for. So this is what DIO wants to do, and what we want to try to do when it comes to digital transformation in the partnerships that we formulate. So a little bit about what whole-of-government is. I think this notion has come up, over the course of the past few years more actively now. You've maybe heard of it in different contexts and different literatures. And what largely notionally it means is just, to look into digital transformation in more cross-sectoral, cross-ministerial settings. So comprising a larger sets of actors that understand the needs within their own sector's context, but then see how to elevate the setup and the implementation and the development of the digital assets and the infrastructure itself on a more whole-of-government approach. And this is just one way of looking at inclusion. Obviously, that there are a larger a more inclusive lens into this, because we also need to look at how it benefits industry and businesses, and how it covers the entire society and all demographics types as well. So whole-of-government is just a way to anchor the approach of where digital can come from, because a large advocate and a large player in a country's digital transformation is from the effort is from the government itself as a core entity. And we talk about approach. There's obviously a lot of different pillars to this. There's not only around the technical framework, which conceptualized initiative that I'll talk about a little bit more. But obviously, there's also political and governance structural implications as well. How do we make sure that all the ministries are working in a way that has a coordinated effort? Some countries do it via, a special mandate from, the office of the president, or a recognition that they have to set up a digital transformation office or agency that specifically look at this cross-sectoral issues. And then, policy setups and policy designs around how to safeguard privacies and data protections, and how do you build literacy in people to understand how to use digital services. Specifically, what I want to focus on today is the technical framework that we are using to anchor our initiative itself, and how we drew a lot of inspiration from other convergence initiatives, and especially in the digital health space and with AHIN in particular. And this is by us starting to look at, how we can come up with the right sets of digital commons, so that it's not only benefiting from one use case, but across multiples along different sectors. And we can't just do this from a top-down kind of approach. Actually, it comes from a more bottoms-up. We look at particular use cases. So in the case, for example, of DICE or decomposing a use case from health, take maybe maternal and child care, for example, the journey itself comprises of things around promoting the service, registrations of the patients and the health seekers on the service, availing the appointments and scheduling and communicational aspects of this, and then the actual intervention segment itself, around consultations. How do you manage the case of that particular patients, availing any kind of diagnostics and tests and so on, and then any kind of payment or financial transactions that might come out of the service itself. But then if you kind of generalize this, you start to see that, well, promotion, registrations, case management, financial transaction management, registration, scheduling, messaging, and communications, those things touches, generically across any kind of public services anyways. And this is how we can start categorizing and framing that set of digital commons that works for a particular country. And this is how we, before the start of this initiative, DIAL and the UN agency, International Telecommunications Union itself, developed this digital investment framework. And it touches on this sets of digital commons. And we named this building blocks, but we didn't name it out of vacuum. A lot of countries that are quite advanced in this kind of thinking already, call their digital commons building blocks themselves. But what building blocks really are is then this sets of generically cross-cutting sector agnostic digital commons that a country recognizes they need to properly develop and own, so that it has a higher potential of reusability and scalability. So it's not only focusing on what promotion needs for health, but if there is also a similar, digitalization needs of another service from another sector, how do they come together to collectively understand what that particular service block or that building block of digital common, what have you, is required functionally and technically. And by dissecting these use cases is where you start, coming into this convergence of building blocks countries need, and actually, inform what those functionalities means for each of those building blocks. And when you do this enough, you start to, you start to converge into a technical normative framework, because then you start looking into all these use cases that have common digital needs, and then that building block, you recognize and re-recognize the use of common building blocks over time. And this is where the concept or the notion of our framework itself, and largely the technical implication of whole of government approach, comes in. And we're not doing this, just theoretically. We've seen countries that are looking into approaching digital government, their next generation of digital government, this way as well. But like I said, it's around looking into cross-cutting, looking into use cases first, and then looking into the cross-cutting needs in terms of digitalization of those use cases, and then converging it into a set of digital commons and digital building blocks, and then developing those digital building blocks so that there is a higher level of reusability and agility, because maybe you need to account for the next critical events, maybe in health, maybe in conflict, maybe in environment, but then your foundational layers are set to do this. So it's a question of creating a more resilient digital public infrastructure as well in a country setting. So this is where, the concept of a government stack, or in this case, why we're inspired to call ourselves GovStack, came in. And this is as in the introduction implicated, a multilateral initiative with the ITU, plus the Economic Development Corporation of Germany and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Estonia itself. And it's really to help countries make sense of this technical framework and see how to apply this technical framework in their context of digital government transformation efforts. And as I said, this is not something that was develop out of the vacuum. There are different motivations of why countries are going into this route. Naturally and obviously, in the partnership with Estonia as us in the digital development space, come to know and admire that they're quite a leading example. And when it comes to digital government, they emphasize a lot of interoperability. They are a small country. They want to make sure that whatever it's developed and created has the highest yield of reuse possible. And so, what kind of value or motivation is driven by them to follow this whole of government approach? Each countries might have a different story to tell, but all of them kind of end up converging into a similar picture. They understood that there is a need to set up and maintain and continue that effort of evaluating what is common across their sectoral needs in terms of digitalization. Estonia, as I mentioned, has a highly valued example of interoperability, and it's actually been replicated, or their solutions is highly regarded by other countries now, and it's this underlying platform for X-Road. In the emerging case that we are also working with Ukraine, it's around how to make sure that the digital government is, stays resilient in the time of conflicts. India also has a high success story of how, starting with financial inclusion, it became such a powerful example of how digital touches on many aspects of people's life, and achieving that kind of high coverage on digital identity as well in the country. So when it comes to inclusion and scale, I'm not going to touch on the rest of the country examples, but regardless of what motivation it came from, the countries ultimately naturally understood that there's a way of looking into adopting a more whole of government, a more interoperable, a more agile and resilient, plus a more coordinated approach when it comes to digitalization. And this is where we went back to the notion of whole of government itself. What we've seen and what we have observed in some early literature around the benefits of this, it's obviously, as I mentioned, this kind of agility and speed, because the more you understand that cross-cutting functional requirements and the technical design of these digital commons or these building blocks, your next services will have a greater, a marginal speed of, setup and return. And the more cross-sectoral this underlying foundation serves, the more cost efficient it becomes. The next services wouldn't take as much development effort, and it can be stood up a lot more easily. You just need a bit of contextualization. And there is actual yield in terms of economic return, because it's easier to set up businesses, it's easier to make transactions, and there is studies, I think, in the case of maybe India, some projections on how an approach like this actually creates real economic return yields. And on the interaction with citizens and people, it brings a level of smoothness in the interaction, in the interaction, in the experience itself, because the underlying services serves more than just one sector now. So the experience becomes more seamless when you navigate, even though the services might touches on multiple ministries or departments. That experience as a whole become more seamless. And there is also the larger notion over time from countries and from partners on this vendor lock-in, this last point. And this largely has to do with number one, focus, looking into an approach like this, but also looking into now how open source public solutions can be a way of fulfilling that need, fulfilling that digitalization needs. So not necessarily saying that you have to develop something from scratch that is open source, but looking into how open source digital public goods themselves can serve as a way of enabling their digital public infrastructure in their design itself. So then bringing back to what we do on GovStack side a little bit, we focus on really developing references to what this technical framework implicates. So we first focus on high priority building blocks, things that are really foundational around ID, around registrations, around payments, things that are components to any country's digital public infrastructure. And what we do is we try to formulate sets of expert groups and to see how to create this evolving references on what's a cross-sectoral, interoperable ID payment registration building blocks, what have you look like, what is their technical functionalities, what are the best practices out there, what are some protocols and policy implications that needs to be looked at and studied more closely if it's around different approaches to design, when centralization, decentralizations, and so on. And then as we move into the rest of the building blocks, this is something that we want to shape up as well. This is not something that we're only doing in silos with experts that we know in our circle. We wanted to make sure we engage countries that are notionally very knowledgeable in this type of work. So we do have participations from the likes of personnel from key ministries, personnel from India, from Singapore, from Estonia, obviously, and other countries that are quite advanced in this building block approach. And then as we move and expand into the rest of the building blocks, we'll seek to also, as you can see on the left, build out what the test bed environment looks like, because it's not so much just for us to develop a set of reference on paper and then we say this is how you can take it into your country and put it into practice. We wanted to make sure that there is a way for both countries that are demanding this kind of references to understand how they play out in a testbed environment, but also on the supply side for the digital public goods market to come and demonstrate how their solutions and services comply with or help facilitate this kind of approach. So we are putting together sort of a connecting testbed environments, what have you, that will take in use cases that we want to work in with countries and with program partners, and expose these building blocks as a reference point, and for solutions and products to self-demonstrate themselves or see how they can address the needs as use cases being more embedded in the testbed, and the building block references evolved the solutions themselves. How do they serve to provide or facilitate those specific components themselves? And actually then that creates a whole acceleration that we talked about in the introduction, because now if a country has some priority use cases they wanted to experience, and they wanted to know which building blocks they need to be able to serve this, and serve it in a way that is once as a building block addressing a range of their use cases, and then have a set of references that they can then build themselves, procure, develop jointly, what have you. They can see what product and solutions exist out there, or they can see what are the technical requirements and functionalities they need from a building blocks point of view. This is the anchoring point of what we talked about when it comes to the accelerating the the implementation and the design thinking of a country when it comes to digital government services. So on top of the technical framework, there is other areas that we are looking at where we're developing activities and efforts around as well. So not only just looking at experts that are coming to help us design this building block references themselves, but what are advanced countries thinking when it comes to the governance of this, when it comes to the end-to-end design of that user experience. So for example, we've drawn on examples from Canada, from UK, and from others that have looked at this holistically. What are the service principles that I put in practice when it comes to designing things that are user-centric, that accounts for high degree of accessibility for any kind of citizens' needs, or when it comes to the UK systems has a set of service principles, for example, that ties into our digital principles as well, things around understanding the user, things around understanding the ecosystem, and so on. So it's not only the technical framework that we seek to build out, but we want to work with countries that are on this pathway that wants to move into this whole of government approach direction, and they want to get that experience from those that have done that have been further in the journey itself. So we and the sets of partners and experts and the country teams that we are setting up across the 4 partners that I talked about, put together what we call the country engagement implementation framework. So it's not only the building block reference themselves, but also how that fits into the entire service design aspect, the policy and governance thinking that has to go into place, and also the thinking about the capacity building nature that has to go hand in hand if that approach is to be realized in the countries that we work with more closely. And this is also on the technical side on the right, not only putting this test bed in practice, not only putting the sets of references, but the entire notion of how those building blocks of digital commons actually can interoperate through frameworks around enterprise architecture. So this is something, for example, that we understood that the health sector has quite an advanced advantage over the others, because they've thought about this and they've developed different frameworks to address this. So we drew a lot of motivations from things like TOGAF, from OpenHIE, and so on, to actually help expand that scope of enterprise architectural thinking, not only within health, but also broader. And so this, what you see here is just some of the examples of ways that we're also supporting countries in the journey of the digital transformation and the adoption of this whole of government approach. As I mentioned before, we wanted to also see what is out there in the ecosystem when it comes to services to solutions that already exist. And this is where we also look to connect with the understanding the standards and the evolving concept of digital public goods. These are notionally largely open source solutions, open data, open standards that address SDG targets, and it aligns quite well to what we do at this point in time. We're not saying that we will only be enforcing how digital public goods seeks to help us realize this kind of approach, but this digital public goods is a good starting point because they are already scalable solutions that have been done in development projects themselves. And also there are a lot of other conversion initiatives out there, and AEHIN being one of the examples when it comes particularly to capacity building, that we draw a lot of inspiration from that. But there's also harmonization that we wanted to work on with other technical frameworks and donor groups, and these are just examples of some of them. We're also focusing a little bit on the architectural aspect of this, and this is why we work with Open Group and OpenHIE, for example. And when it comes to what kind of community practice we wanted to look into, or what kind of use cases that we can bring into the picture to rigorously test out our building blocks, engaging with convergent initiatives like the likes of the social protection interagency boards and the digital convergence initiative that was born out of it, but also other communities of practice like AEHIN, and in addition to actual development and donor groups as well that are looking into digital as kind of a regional or donor level harmonization issues or agenda. These are the examples that we wanted to work more closely with as well. So this is a lot of text, but thinking about how the digital public health and the digital public infrastructure interact or intersect between the two. I think that we can draw a lot of references to what digital health has done in the past. Specifically when we're talking about whole of government as the technical setup of whole of society, whole of government approach, logically implies looking into how enterprise architecture could be the underlying blueprint for it. And in the health sector, that has been a realization for quite some time. And we can look at how to bring the two together in a more cohesive way, drawing out of what has been done from the health space on interoperability, on data privacy and data protections, those elements that are quite advanced in thinking in health, but also extrapolating towards the rest of digital transformation effort of a country itself. And also health traditionally has been the one that it leads in terms of a setup of an ID. And as countries are now looking into how identification, digital identification, forms a core foundation of any kind of government services digitally that they want to develop or deliver. This is something that's we can build on the momentum from health, and to look at how either we can improve the setup from health, or to see what we can learn from health to draw on a more federated approach or a more centralized approach. Different countries take on different pathway, but it's an interesting area that I think a lot of actors are looking into more closely, being that health and large, to some extent, social security, social protections, those are the ones that always seek to benefit from an identification system to start. And as I mentioned in the beginning, with the critical events that are happening, with the competing now focuses and resources that are in place because of these critical events, you're going to have, I think we will have some further challenges of how we can coordinate a funding framework that is scalable, that requires, a higher level of understanding of how products and services interoperate, and how, this notion of digital commons is a way to not only not only helps to maintain and sustain digital services in health, but also help help advocate for the notion of coordinated funding across the rest of the sectors that do also need to benefit from this kind of digital approaches. So it overcomes the traditional silo of funding specifically going into one sector. But even when it comes to financial planning for a country itself, looking into the cross-sectoral needs in the lens of digital commons and digital public infrastructure, and then see where the contextualization or where prioritization of the services in health, in social security, social protection, education, agriculture, and otherwise would arise when it comes to strategy planning. That enables a lot more agility and equally still able to help country projects, more realistically the sets of the entire funding landscape of the sets of services that are being prioritized, but on the notion of setting up or continue to evolve this kind of digital infrastructure in the back. So on that note, I wanted to welcome the members of AHIN or any countries that are working in digital efforts in health to come and take a look at what we do, take a look at how we're interacting with other countries when it comes to setting up this kind of digital commons references, how we're providing experiences to countries and extrapolating lessons from those that have been more advanced along the way. Certainly health is a specific sector, but as a country reference as a whole as well, but that's through the country engagement experience and the framework and playbook, as I mentioned as well, and help us understand or help identify what kind of solutions and products that exist out there that might have traditionally helped benefit health as a sector in the digitalization efforts, to see how that can be reused in other settings, and to learn experience from health in terms of interoperability and the capacity building aspect as well. And doing this quite regularly when it comes to TOGAF and so on. We want to make sure that the rest of country government learns about this as well, and they appreciate what this means when it comes to enterprise architecture. This is something, for example, where Dial itself is doing with Sierra Leone when it comes to their digital government transformation strategy and needs. So if I can leave with you all one notion of how universal digital coverage really does enable and bilaterally enables universal health coverage. This is something I wanted to kind of bring it back home, as we look at enriching and strengthening this foundational sets of digital commons. It also helps to make digital health services more agile. And as we build capacity in the country on citizen literature and understanding of digital services, then digital health as an enabler to universal health coverage also becomes easier. So I wanted to make sure that we work towards the same common goals, and that when it comes to us, even if we're looking at country national strategies around digital transformation, that we account for these development agendas when it comes to universal health coverage, or when it comes to agile and scalable social protection schemes, or when it comes to mitigating environmental issues and so on. We wanted to make the whole of government not only just about digital transformation of a country, but to make it more a just transition, a more comprehensive transition. for a country to reap benefits from digitalization itself. So with that, this is my invitation to anyone, in the audience and today Hidden Family again, to reach out and to learn about what we do, and to use digital health as an example of how we can, help the rest of the countries learn about the advanced thinking of digitalization in the health sector itself. Thank you very much for that, and I will take any questions now from the audience.
Thank you very much for the presentation, Sir Sherman. So far we have 3 questions from our participants. For the first one, we have Dr. Bunchai saying there are many GovStack products. Could you give a real life example of the country that implements these technical products?
Yeah, so for example, when it comes to our partner Estonia, as I mentioned, their interoperability layer, or this solution they have called XRO, has been quite widely adopted and celebrated as an example. Then I think it was born out of Estonia, but now it became housed under an open source entity called NIS, and this is an entity that's looking into strengthening the design and the functionality of XRO itself, but also seeing how that can be used in other countries. I think, for example, I think in the context of us working with Horn of Africa, there's one of the countries there that are already in the process of adopting XRO as well as an open source technology, but also as the interoperability framework. Another example from India is Aadhaar, UPI, and the entire India stack actually. So it's also a highly interoperable identification layer and payment layer that's traditionally was to support financial inclusion of the country, and now it becomes such a widely adopted or it's widely embedded as part of the India's digital governance stack itself.
Thank you, Sir Sherman. Our next question is from Dr. EJ. How would you address different policy practices standard from US and EU regulations that may not be applicable to Asian countries? Example, some countries are conservative in PII, facial recognition, versus countries that are adaptable to such new technologies.
Yeah, I mean, the new technology as an emerging tools, even in the in the US and others, policy regulations are still being evaluated and changed. I don't think it's so much for us to address or to exclusively reference one way or another, but we have to obviously account for the contextualization of the different countries themselves. So we're not saying notionally that we say that a particular US policy around AI or around data exchange works for others. What we want to make sure is we collectively look into these as best practices for other countries to follow. So if in the policy environment of another country, it seems that it's more adoptable, the US policy or the US way of looking into digital identification issues, or India's example of a federated and decentralized system versus Estonia's very strongly centralized a way of managing and maintaining digital government infrastructure. Those are the approaches that those are all references that are valuable to us. And as we look into engaging specific countries, then it's the time when it comes to policy discussions and when we unpack their strategy and their and their existing laws and regulations themselves, and we'll see where it fits appropriately. But we're not saying that one policy schemes serves all.
Yes, thank you. We have another question, Sir Sherman. This is from Dr. Tep. He's sharing that in their country, Laos, the first wave is not yet in place, but the third wave, which is supported by DPs, has more systems. So it is very hard to move to data exchange. Do you have any suggestions?
I think it will be great if we can, have more bilateral discussions on this. I can't speak off the top of my head because your country's context might be different from others. I think where we can start to break down some of those silos so that you can allow for greater data exchange is to see, where there are opportunities for data exchange to happen to begin with, or where are the needs for data exchanges to be put in place. Because if you've experienced barriers in terms of providing services because exchanges hasn't been in place from one department or ministry to another, we can dissect the systems themselves and then see where those interoperability points or opportunities exist, and the kind of solutions and services that could be put in place, so you're not completely revamping the systems on top, but there is a way to open up through access, through API designs or what have you, to at least start enabling that kind of exchanges in the hopes of a more holistic whole-of-government convergence over time on interoperability on data exchanges themselves.
Thank you, Sir Sherman. I think we have a message from Dr. Vladimir sharing that Kyrgyzstan has implemented X-Road, known as Tunduk. Dr. Vladimir, maybe you can briefly share about this if you wish on the microphone. We have a few minutes left in the session.
Hi, colleagues. That was just a comment, not a question. So with the limited time, perhaps we could go to Bunchai's question. And thanks, Sherman, for the presentation.
Thank you.
I think Dr. Bunchai is only confirming if GovStack is an international NGO, like AIN.
So currently we're not legally it's not a standalone entity. This is more of a community effort at this time, with the 4 development agencies working on different areas of activities themselves. But this is something that we'll look into over time if it makes sense for us to institutionalize this a little bit more. At this moment, it's a community. That's why we would welcome anyone or any kind of other community practice like AEN to be part of this also.
Thank you, Sir Sherman. I think we only have 2 minutes left. Maybe we can hear from our chair, Dr. Bunchai.
Oh, thank you very much, Sherman. And it is very important and inspiring presentation, and we are very thankful for that. My last question is because of we grow similar to what the GovStack has grown. We have a informal network trying to create a community of practice, and we have to be the INGO to support more our community. That was the reason for the last question. We are very familiar and working with many developing partner that support GovStack, like Dial and GIZ or something like that. And it's very happy. Many of the principles that the GovStack do, we are already adopt and working onto that. I think we can be joy force to pushing on these kind of the building blocks and also more open digital infrastructure like that. Thank you very much, and we think we are happy to work together and then pushing all these principle agenda to our government. Thank you.
No, thank you very much as well. Let's talk. I would love to see how we can engage IB again a little bit more.
Okay.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Bye.
Have a nice day, Sir Sherman. Good night, everyone.
Good afternoon, good evening. Cheers.